Two police officers taunt and extinguish a cigarette on a black man's arm, but a shocking discovery awaits them the next day. Subscribe and post in the comments where you're watching this from. The train slowed as it approached the station, its brakes squealing in protest. Outside the window, the sprawling skyline of the city came into view, a tapestry of steel, glass, and smog, the morning sun glinting off its jagged peaks. From a distance, it might have seemed majestic, but as the train drew closer, the flaws became more apparent. Graffiti-covered walls surrounded the tracks, trash piled high in alleyways, and shadows moved between the buildings with an urgency that spoke of survival, not ambition. Elijah Williams adjusted his tie as he gathered his belongings. The dark, tailored suit he wore bore the marks of a meticulous man, perfectly pressed, not a single thread out of place. His shoes, though slightly scuffed from the journey, still gleamed with a military shine. As he straightened his posture, the small silver pin on his lapel, a simple star surrounded by a laurel, caught the light, a subtle reminder of his rank and the responsibilities that came with it. The train came to a stop, and the intercom crackled. "Welcome to Maple Grove Central Station," the voice announced. Elijah stood, his tall frame unfolding with deliberate precision, and stepped off the train onto the bustling platform. Around him, a cacophony of noise filled the air, the hum of conversation, the blaring horns of taxis outside, and the rhythmic clatter of heels on the tiled floor. The city pulsed with life, but beneath its surface, Elijah could sense tension. This was a place on edge, a place teetering on the brink of something unspoken. He walked with purpose, his suitcase in one hand and a weathered leather briefcase in the other. People moved around him like a current, their eyes darting toward him briefly before sliding away. He felt their judgment, their silent appraisals. A tall, well-dressed black man in a city like this was bound to draw attention, not all of it welcome. As he reached the taxi stand, a middle-aged driver with salt and pepper hair waved him over. Elijah climbed into the cab, placing his luggage carefully by his side. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked, his voice tinged with curiosity. "Elton District," Elijah replied, his tone calm but firm. The driver's eyebrows lifted slightly. "The police precinct?" Elijah nodded. "Ah," the man said, starting the engine. "Good luck, Captain." The cab merged into the chaotic traffic, and Elijah leaned back, studying the city through the window. The driver, apparently eager to talk, began a monologue about the state of Maple Grove. "Been driving these streets for 20 years, he said. "Used to be a decent place, you know. Sure, we had our problems, but it wasn't like this. Now, corruption in the precinct, gangs running wild, protests every other week. It's a mess. And don't even get me started on the cops. Half of them are just as bad as the criminals." Elijah listened silently, his expression unreadable. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "You from here, Captain?" "No," Elijah said simply, "but I'm here to fix it." The driver chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Fix it, huh? Well, you've got your work cut out for you." As they entered Elton District, the scenery shifted. The buildings grew older, their facades weathered by time and neglect. Boarded-up storefronts lined the streets, and groups of young men loitered on corners, their eyes following the cab with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. It was a neighborhood worn down by struggle, but beneath the decay there was still life. Children played on cracked sidewalks, their laughter a brief reprieve from the harshness around them. The cab pulled up in front of the precinct, a gray stone building that loomed over the street like a fortress. Elijah stepped out and paid the driver, who offered him a faint, almost pitying smile before driving off. Standing on the steps of the precinct, Elijah took a deep breath. The weight of his new role settled on his shoulders like an old, familiar coat. He had faced challenges before, on battlefields and in boardrooms, but this was different. Here, he wasn't just fighting corruption or crime. He was fighting perception, prejudice, and a deeply ingrained system resistant to change. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was stifling. The air smelled of stale coffee and sweat, and the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glare over the dingy interior. Officers moved about with varying degrees of urgency, their conversations a low murmur, punctuated by the occasional burst of laughter. Most of them didn't notice Elijah as he entered, but a few glanced his way, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disdain. At the front desk, a young officer barely looked up from his paperwork. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone indifferent. "I'm Captain Williams," Elijah said evenly. "I'm here to assume command." The officer froze, his pen hovering mid-air. He looked up, his eyes widening slightly as he took in Elijah's imposing figure. Welcome, Captain," he stammered. "The chief's expecting you." Elijah nodded and made his way to the chief's office, his footsteps echoing in the corridor. As he passed, conversations ceased and heads turned. He felt their eyes on him, heard the whispers that followed in his wake. "Is that him? He's the new guy? Doesn't look like he'll last long." Reaching the office, Elijah knocked once before entering. The chief, a stout man with thin hair and a face lined with stress, stood to greet him. "Captain Williams," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Chief Donner. Welcome to Maple Grove." "Thank you, Chief," Elijah said, shaking his hand firmly. Donner gestured for him to sit. "I won't sugarcoat it," he began. "This precinct is a mess. Morale is low, trust is non-existent, and the community, they hate us. You've got your work cut out for you." "I expected nothing less," Elijah replied. The conversation continued, outlining the challenges ahead. As Elijah left the office, he couldn't ignore the sense of foreboding that hung in the air. This was a battleground, and the fight was just beginning. The streets of Elton District were alive with their usual rhythm, a mixture of chaos and routine. Vendors yelled over each other, selling everything from second-hand clothes to street food. Children darted between parked cars, their laughter echoing against the cracked facades of the buildings. Despite the energy, a layer of tension hung in the air, as though everyone was waiting for something to snap. Elijah Williams walked through the neighborhood with deliberate calm. He had chosen to leave his car behind, opting instead for a stroll through the streets. He wanted to observe, to feel the pulse of the community he was here to serve. His dark suit made him stand out against the casual, worn attire of the locals, and his towering frame drew glances wherever he went. Some looked at him with curiosity, others with suspicion. He was used to both. As he turned a corner, his steps slowed. Two uniformed police officers stood by their patrol car, engaged in a conversation that seemed far too casual for men on duty. The taller of the two, a stocky man with a square jaw and a perpetual scowl, was smoking a cigarette. His name tag read Howell. The other officer, slimmer and younger, had an air of unease about him, his eyes constantly scanning the street as though expecting trouble. His name was Warren. Elijah caught their attention immediately. Howell's gaze locked onto him, his eyes narrowing. Warren glanced at him briefly, then looked away, shifting on his feet. Elijah could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but he continued walking, his expression unreadable. "Hey, you!" Howell's voice cut through the air, sharp and commanding. Elijah stopped, turning slowly to face them. He kept his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture calm but firm. "Yes," he replied evenly. "You live around here?" Howell asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. "I don't see how that's relevant," Elijah said. Howell took a step closer, the cigarette dangling from his lips. "It's relevant when someone's wandering around like they don't belong. Let's see some ID." Elijah's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "Is there a reason for this stop, officer?" Howell smirked. "Yeah, suspicious behavior." Elijah could feel the eyes of the community on them now. A small crowd had started to gather, their murmurs filling the air. He reached into his pocket slowly, pulling out his wallet. Howell snatched the ID card without so much as a glance at Elijah's face, inspecting it with exaggerated scrutiny. "Williams," Howell said, drawing out the name as though testing its weight. "So, what do you do, Mr. Williams?" "Captain Williams," Elijah corrected. "And what I do is none of your concern." That caught Howell off guard, but only for a moment. His smirk returned, more venomous this time. "Captain, huh? You military or something?" "Something like that," Elijah said, his voice calm but edged with steel. Howell stepped closer, invading Elijah's personal space. The cigarette, now nearly burned down to the filter, dangled precariously. "Well, Captain, you're in our neighborhood now. We call the shots here." Behind him, Warren shifted uncomfortably. "Hey, Howell, maybe we should just—" "Quiet," Howell snapped without turning around. Warren's mouth closed, his jaw tightening. Elijah said nothing, his eyes locked on Howell's. The silence stretched, heavy with tension. Finally, Howell broke it. "You think you're something special, don't you?" he sneered. Then, in a deliberate, calculated motion, he took the cigarette from his mouth and pressed the smoldering end into the back of Elijah's hand. A sharp hiss filled the air, followed by a collective gasp from the crowd. Elijah's body tensed, but he didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unyielding. Howell's smirk faltered as the realization of what he'd done sank in. Elijah looked at the burn on his hand, then back at Howell. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but filled with authority. "You're going to regret that." Howell laughed, though it sounded forced. "Yeah? We'll see about that." Without another word, Elijah took his ID back, turned, and walked away. The crowd parted for him, their eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. Some muttered under their breath, others simply stared. Elijah's steps were measured, his back straight, but his mind was racing. He hadn't wanted to make a scene, not so soon after arriving, but this was more than a scene. This was a statement, and one that would echo far beyond this street corner. Back at the precinct, Howell leaned against his desk, recounting the story to a small group of officers. His tone was mocking, his audience laughing at the absurdity of some guy thinking he could intimidate us. Warren sat nearby, silent and pale, his hands fidgeting with the edge of a report. "You should have seen him," Howell said, grinning, "standing there all high and mighty. I had to knock him down a peg." One of the officers chuckled. "Did he fight back?" "Not a chance," Howell said, walked away like a good little boy. Warren glanced up, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe we shouldn't have—" "Don't start," Howell snapped. "You're either with me or you're not." Warren looked away, his expression conflicted. In that moment, he realized just how deep he was in, and how hard it would be to climb out. Later that evening, Elijah sat in his temporary apartment, staring at his hand. The burn throbbed, but he barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, replaying the day's events. He thought of the officers, the crowd, the tension that seemed to hang over the city like a storm cloud. He clenched his fist, the pain grounding him. Tomorrow he would face them again, but this time it would be on his terms. "Don't be late," he murmured to himself, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. Tomorrow would be a day they wouldn't forget. The sun crept over the horizon, casting a pale light on the streets of Elton District. The neighborhood was already stirring. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors, delivery trucks rattled by, and early commuters shuffled toward bus stops. Inside the precinct, the day began like any other, until Captain Elijah Williams walked through the door. The gray stone walls of the precinct were a far cry from welcoming. They loomed over the room, oppressive and indifferent. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the scuffed linoleum floors. Officers bustled around, their conversations low and hurried. The clatter of keyboards, the shuffle of papers, and the occasional ring of a phone blended into a monotonous hum. But when Elijah stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. Heads turned, conversations halted, and whispers followed in his wake. Some officers glanced at him with curiosity, others with outright skepticism. Elijah strode through the room, his posture erect and his expression unreadable. He carried himself with an air of authority that demanded attention, but beneath his composed exterior, he felt the weight of their eyes, their silent judgments. At the front desk, a young officer with sandy hair and an overwhelmed expression looked up. "Captain Williams," Elijah said evenly, his voice cutting through the noise. The officer's eyes widened slightly, and he scrambled to his feet. Yes, sir," the young man stammered. "Chief Donner is expecting you. His office is down the hall." Elijah nodded and continued on his way, his footsteps echoing in the corridor. As he passed, officers parted to let him through. Some offered stiff nods, others avoided his gaze altogether. He noted their body language, their hushed exchanges. It was clear that his arrival was not just news, it was a disruption. Chief Donner sat behind his desk, his round face creased with a mixture of weariness and relief. When Elijah entered, the chief stood, extending a hand. "Captain Williams," he said, his voice gruff but cordial, "welcome to Maple Grove." "Thank you, Chief," Elijah replied, shaking his hand firmly. Donner gestured to the chair opposite him. "Have a seat. Let's get you up to speed." Elijah sat, his posture straight, his attention focused. Donner leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together. "I won't sugarcoat it, Captain. This precinct is in rough shape. Morale is in the gutter, and the community, they don't trust us. Hell, I don't blame them. There's been incidents." "Incidents?" Elijah prompted. Donner sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Excessive force, corruption, racial profiling, you name it. The officers here aren't bad people, but they've been operating without accountability for too long. And then there's Howell." Elijah's expression didn't change, but his interest sharpened. "Howell? Sergeant Robert Howell," Donner said. "Been here for years. Knows the ropes, knows the people, and knows how to push boundaries without breaking them. He's got a lot of influence. Too much, if you ask me." Elijah filed the information away. "And Warren?" "His partner," Donner said with a shrug. "Young, impressionable, follows Howell's lead. If you're looking for loyalty, it's probably not with them." Elijah nodded. He had expected resistance, but hearing it confirmed only solidified his resolve. "What's my starting point, Chief?" "Do what you have to do," Donner said. "Clean house if you need to. Just be careful. This place doesn't take well to change." Later that morning, Elijah stood at the front of the precinct's briefing room. The officers filed in slowly, their expressions ranging from neutral to openly defiant. Howell sauntered in last, a smug grin on his face. Warren trailed behind him, his shoulders hunched. Elijah surveyed the room, taking a moment to let the silence settle. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear, cutting through the tension like a blade. "Good morning. I'm Captain Elijah Williams, and as of today, I'm in command of this precinct." The room remained silent, but Elijah could feel the undercurrent of resistance. He continued, his gaze sweeping over the officers. "I've been brought here to address the issues that have plagued this precinct for far too long. Let me be clear. My priority is to restore trust, both within this department and with the community we serve." Howell shifted in his seat, his smirk growing wider. "Sounds like a tall order," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the room to hear. Elijah's eyes flicked to Howell. He didn't smile, but his calm demeanor remained unshaken. "It is. But I've never shied away from a challenge." The tension in the room thickened. Howell leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "With all due respect, Captain, what makes you think you can do what no one else could?" Elijah met Howell's gaze directly. "Because I don't just demand change. I lead by example." The room was silent. Howell's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. Elijah turned his attention back to the group. "I'm not here to play favorites. I'm here to make this precinct better. That means accountability, discipline, and respect, both for each other and for the people out there." He gestured toward the window where the sounds of the city filtered through. "They're counting on us, whether they trust us or not, and it's our job to earn that trust back." As the officers dispersed, Howell lingered near the door, watching Elijah. Warren stood beside him, his expression unreadable. "This is going to be fun," Howell said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "What do you think, rookie? Think our new captain has what it takes?" Warren hesitated. "I think he's serious." Howell laughed, clapping Warren on the back. "Serious doesn't mean anything in this place, kid. He'll learn that soon enough." In his office, Elijah reviewed files and reports, his focus unwavering. He knew Howell and others like him would be obstacles, but obstacles could be overcome. His burn, now bandaged, throbbed faintly, a reminder of the encounter on the street. He flexed his hand, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just about cleaning up a precinct. This was about setting a standard, about proving that integrity could stand firm even in the face of resistance. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the precinct's logo painted on the wall. The battle was just beginning. The days following Elijah's arrival unfolded in a mixture of calculated patience and unspoken conflict. The precinct functioned like a machine running on old gears. It moved, but the grinding of its parts was loud and uncoordinated. Elijah's presence was a new cog, and the resistance to his authority was palpable. Howell made no effort to hide his disdain. He operated with the arrogance of someone who believed himself untouchable. His conversations with fellow officers were laced with sarcasm about the new captain, while his actions hinted at deeper, more deliberate provocations. If Elijah noticed, he didn't let it show. One afternoon, a report came in about a robbery in progress at a convenience store. Elijah observed as Howell and Warren were dispatched. As the scene unfolded through the radio, Elijah noticed discrepancies in Howell's communication. The details he relayed were vague, and his tone carried a smug indifference that grated on Elijah's nerves. Deciding to intervene, Elijah grabbed his jacket and headed to the scene. The store was a cramped, dimly lit space, its aisles packed with mismatched goods. The air reeked of stale tobacco and cleaning chemicals. Howell leaned against the counter, his demeanor casual, as though he were waiting for coffee, not investigating a crime. The store clerk, a wiry man in his 50s, gestured animatedly, frustration evident in his voice. Warren stood nearby, scribbling in his notebook, his eyes flicking between Howell and the clerk. Elijah entered, his presence shifting the atmosphere. Howell straightened, but kept his smirk firmly in place. "Captain," Howell drawled, "didn't think you'd join us for this little neighborhood drama." Elijah ignored the bait, turning to the clerk. "What happened here, sir?" The man launched into his story, detailing how two masked figures had entered the store, demanded cash, and fled when another customer entered. Howell's account had left out key details, and Elijah's questions revealed even more gaps. Warren, sensing the shift in tone, became increasingly uncomfortable. As the clerk finished, Elijah turned to Howell. "Why didn't you mention the second suspect?" Howell shrugged. "Didn't seem relevant. They're long gone anyway." "Every detail is relevant," Elijah said, his voice calm but firm. "We're here to do our job, not make assumptions." Howell's smirk faltered for a moment before he recovered. "Sure thing, Captain." Back at the precinct, Elijah called Warren into his office. The young officer hesitated at the door, his nervousness evident. Elijah gestured for him to sit, studying him for a moment before speaking. "You've been Howell's partner for a while," Elijah said. "What do you think of how he handled today's call?" Warren shifted uncomfortably. "Howell knows the area," he said cautiously. "He's been here a lot longer than I have." "That's not what I asked," Elijah said. "I want your assessment." Warren hesitated, then sighed. "He takes shortcuts sometimes. Says it's more efficient." Elijah leaned back, his expression unreadable. "Do you agree?" Warren didn't meet his eyes. "I don't know." "You do," Elijah said. "You just don't want to say it." Warren glanced up, startled. Elijah's gaze was steady, but not unkind. "This isn't about throwing anyone under the bus, Warren. It's about doing what's right. If we let things slide, we're no better than the people we're supposed to be protecting this city from." Warren nodded, though his uncertainty lingered. As he left the office, Elijah felt a pang of empathy. The young officer was caught in Howell's shadow, struggling to find his own footing. It was a dynamic Elijah had seen before, and he knew it wouldn't change overnight. That evening, Howell made his next move. During a routine patrol, he orchestrated a situation designed to embarrass Elijah. A call came in about a suspicious individual loitering near an abandoned warehouse. Howell suggested Elijah accompany them, framing it as an opportunity for the captain to see the streets firsthand. The scene at the warehouse was quiet, almost eerily so. The suspect, a wiry teenager with a backpack, stood near the entrance, his posture defensive. Howell approached with exaggerated confidence, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "What are you doing here, kid?" Howell demanded. The boy stammered, trying to explain that he was waiting for a friend. Howell didn't let him finish, pulling the backpack off his shoulder and dumping its contents onto the ground. Books and a half-eaten sandwich spilled out, clearly not the tools of a criminal. Elijah stepped forward. "That's enough," he said, his tone cutting through Howell's theatrics. Howell turned, feigning innocence. "Just doing my job, Captain." "No," Elijah said, his voice steady. "You're making a spectacle. Let him go." The tension between them crackled like static electricity. Howell hesitated, then stepped back with a mock bow. "Whatever you say, Captain." As the boy hurried away, Elijah stared Howell down. "This isn't how we operate," he said. "You're done here for the night. Go back to the precinct." Howell's smirk vanished, replaced by a glint of anger. He didn't argue, but the look he gave Elijah as he left spoke volumes. Warren, who had watched the exchange in silence, finally spoke. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "Yes, I did," Elijah replied, "and so will you, if you want to be part of the solution." The rest of the patrol passed without incident, but Elijah knew the battle was far from over. Howell wouldn't back down, and Warren was still finding his place. As Elijah walked back into the precinct that night, the weight of his task pressed heavier on his shoulders. Change was coming, but it would not come easily. The tension in the precinct had reached a boiling point. Elijah Williams could feel it in the way conversations hushed when he entered a room, in the furtive glances exchanged between officers, and in the thinly veiled hostility radiating from Howell. The sergeant had grown bolder in his defiance, his actions escalating from subtle resistance to outright insubordination. It wasn't a matter of if Howell would cross the line. It was a matter of when. That day, the line was drawn. A major drug bust operation had been planned for weeks, one of the largest the precinct had attempted in recent years. Elijah had spent countless hours reviewing the details, ensuring the plan was airtight. The target was a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, rumored to be a hub for a notorious drug ring. The operation would involve multiple teams, each with specific roles, and precision was critical. Elijah called a briefing in the morning, laying out the strategy with methodical precision. The room was packed with officers, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Howell sat at the back, leaning casually against the wall, his arms crossed. Warren sat beside him, his posture tense, as though bracing for impact. "This operation is not just about taking down a drug ring," Elijah began, his voice steady but firm. "It's about showing this city that we're capable of doing our job with professionalism and integrity. No shortcuts, no excuses." He let his words hang in the air, his gaze sweeping over the room. Most of the officers nodded, their focus sharpening. Howell, however, smirked, muttering something under his breath. Elijah didn't address it, but he made a mental note. "We'll move out at 1600 hours, Elijah concluded. "Make sure you're ready." As the officers filed out, Elijah called Howell aside. The sergeant approached with his usual air of indifference, his smirk firmly in place. "Something on your mind, Captain?" Howell drawled. "Just making sure we're clear," Elijah said evenly. "This operation needs to go smoothly. I expect you to follow protocol." Howell's smirk widened. "Don't worry, Captain. I'll be a model officer." Elijah held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. "See that you are." The operation began as planned, the teams converging on the warehouse under the cover of twilight. The air was thick with tension, the kind that precedes a storm. Elijah monitored the teams from the command center, his voice calm and steady as he coordinated their movements. Howell's team was assigned to secure the perimeter, a task Elijah had deliberately chosen to minimize the sergeant's ability to disrupt the operation. But Howell had other plans. As the teams breached the warehouse, the situation inside quickly escalated. Suspects scattered, some attempting to flee while others fought back. Elijah kept a close ear on the radio, his commands precise and authoritative. Most of the teams responded seamlessly, their training kicking in. Then came Howell's voice, crackling over the radio. "We've got a runner," he said, his tone casual, almost amused. "Pursuing now." Elijah frowned. Howell's team wasn't supposed to engage directly. Their job was to contain the perimeter. "Hold your position, Howell," Elijah said firmly. "Do not engage." But Howell didn't respond. Seconds later, the sound of gunfire echoed over the radio. Elijah's heart sank. "Team 2, what's your status?" he demanded. "We're clear, Captain," came the reply, "but Howell's gone rogue. He's in pursuit of the suspect." Elijah didn't wait. Grabbing his radio, he barked orders for the remaining teams to secure the scene before heading out after Howell himself. The chase led Elijah to a shadowed alley several blocks from the warehouse. The suspect, a wiry man in his 20s, was cornered, his hands raised in surrender. Howell stood a few feet away, his weapon drawn, his expression cold. "You think you can run from me?" Howell snarled. "You're lucky I didn't shoot you back there." "Drop your weapon," Elijah commanded as he stepped into the alley, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Howell turned, his smirk returning. "Captain, just cleaning up the mess." "This isn't cleaning up. This is reckless endangerment," Elijah said, his tone icy. "Lower your weapon. Now." The suspect shifted nervously, his eyes darting between the two men. Howell hesitated, his smirk faltering. For a moment, it seemed as though he might comply. Then he sneered. "What are you going to do, Captain? Write me up. You don't have what it takes to handle someone like me." Elijah stepped closer, his posture radiating calm authority. "You think this is about me? This is about you, Howell. About the choices you've made, and right now, you're making the worst one of your career." Howell's grip on his weapon tightened, but something in Elijah's voice made him pause. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered the gun. Elijah nodded toward Warren, who had arrived moments earlier, his expression filled with uncertainty. "Warren, secure the suspect," Elijah ordered. "Howell, return to the precinct. We'll deal with this there." Howell's face twisted in anger, but he didn't argue. He stalked off, muttering under his breath, while Warren moved to handcuff the suspect. Elijah watched Howell go, his chest tight with a mixture of relief and frustration. Back at the precinct, Elijah called an emergency meeting. The officers gathered, their expressions tense as they sensed the gravity of the situation. Howell stood at the back, his arms crossed, his smirk gone. Elijah stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the room. "Tonight's operation was a success," he began, "but it could have been a disaster because someone chose to ignore protocol and endanger lives." His eyes locked on Howell, who shifted under the scrutiny. "Sergeant Howell," Elijah continued, his voice steady but sharp, "your actions tonight were not only reckless, but insubordinate. You've left me no choice but to suspend you, effective immediately." The room erupted in murmurs, officers exchanging shocked glances. Howell's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "You can't do this," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I just did," Elijah replied, his tone unyielding. "You have the right to appeal, but until then, you're off duty." Howell stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The remaining officers looked to Elijah, their expressions a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Elijah met their gazes, his own filled with resolve. "This is the standard we're holding ourselves to," he said. "No one is above accountability. Not me, not you, and certainly not Howell." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. As the officers dispersed, Elijah allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. The precinct felt different the next morning. The tension, though still present, had shifted. It was no longer an oppressive cloud hanging over every interaction. Instead, it was a lingering hum, a sign that change was unsettling but inevitable. Elijah Williams arrived early, as was his habit, and found the station quieter than usual. The officers who were present carried themselves with an unspoken awareness that the dynamics had shifted. Elijah's office overlooked the busy main floor, where officers moved between desks and filed reports. He stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the flow of activity. He knew that Howell's suspension had sent shockwaves through the precinct. Some officers undoubtedly saw it as a step toward accountability, while others likely viewed it as an overreach. The knock on his door broke his thoughts. "Come in," he said. Warren stepped inside, his posture as uncertain as ever. His uniform was neat, but there was a nervousness in the way he adjusted his badge. Elijah gestured for him to sit. "Mornin', Warren," Elijah said, his tone calm but firm. "Mornin', Captain," Warren replied, his voice quieter than usual. Elijah studied him for a moment before speaking. "You've been Howell's partner for a while now. I imagine his suspension has put you in a difficult position." Warren hesitated, then nodded. "It has, sir. A lot of people respected Howell. He's been here longer than most of us." "And you?" Elijah asked. "What do you think?" Warren looked down at his hands. I think he was wrong, Captain, about a lot of things, but it's hard to say that when everyone else sees him as untouchable." Elijah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not easy to stand up for what's right, especially when it feels like you're standing alone. But that's the kind of leadership this precinct needs. People willing to do the hard things for the right reasons." Warren shifted in his seat, his eyes meeting Elijah's. "I want to do better, Captain. I don't want to be part of the problem." "Then don't be," Elijah said simply. "It's a choice you make every day with every decision, and it's not about being perfect. It's about being accountable." Warren nodded, a flicker of determination in his expression. "Thank you, Captain." As Warren left, Elijah felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't a complete turnaround, but it was a start. Later that day, Elijah called a meeting with the entire precinct. The officers gathered in the briefing room, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Howell's absence was noticeable, his usual presence replaced by a sense of unease among those who had aligned themselves with him. Elijah stood at the front of the room, his posture commanding yet approachable. He let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking. "We're at a crossroads," he began, his voice steady. "This precinct has operated a certain way for a long time. Some of it has been good. A lot of it hasn't. I'm not here to ignore the past, but I am here to change the future." His gaze swept over the room, meeting the eyes of each officer. Accountability isn't about punishment. It's about trust. Trust within this department, and trust with the community we serve. And right now, that trust is broken, but it can be rebuilt. An older officer raised his hand, his face lined with skepticism. "And how do you propose we do that, Captain? We've been trying for years." "By holding ourselves to a higher standard," Elijah replied. "By treating every case, every interaction, every decision as an opportunity to prove who we are. And by not letting the actions of a few define all of us." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Then a younger officer, seated near the back, spoke up. "What happens to Howell?" Elijah's expression didn't waver. Howell's actions were his own, and he's facing the consequences of those actions. The same would apply to any of us, myself included. That's how trust is built, through consistency and integrity. The officers exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of contemplation and acceptance. It wasn't unanimous, but Elijah hadn't expected it to be. Change was never easy, and acceptance was a process. Over the next few weeks, Elijah's vision for the precinct began to take shape. Training sessions on de-escalation techniques and community engagement were implemented. Officers were encouraged to participate in town hall meetings, listening to the concerns of residents and addressing them with transparency. It was slow work, but there were signs of progress. One evening, Elijah decided to take a walk through Elton District. The streets, though still worn and weary, felt less hostile. People glanced his way with curiosity rather than suspicion. He stopped by a small convenience store, the same one where Howell had dismissed a robbery as neighborhood drama. The clerk recognized him immediately. "Captain Williams," the man said, a note of respect in his voice. "Good to see you again." "Good to see you too," Elijah replied. "How's business?" "Better," the clerk said with a nod. "People are noticing the difference. Feels like maybe things are changing." Elijah smiled faintly. That's the goal. As he stepped back onto the street, he noticed a group of kids playing basketball in a nearby park. Their laughter echoed through the night, a sound of hope in a place that had seen so much despair. Back at the precinct, Elijah sat in his office, reviewing the latest reports. The burn on his hand, now healed but still faintly visible, caught his attention. It was a reminder of how far they had come, and how much further there was to go. Warren knocked on the door, stepping inside with a hesitant smile. "Just wanted to say thanks, Captain," he said, "for giving me a chance." Elijah nodded. "You earned it." As Warren left, Elijah leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the precinct's logo on the wall. The battle was far from over, but for the first time it felt winnable. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight there was progress. And that was enough. The precinct's transformation was far from instantaneous. Like the slow thaw of winter, the changes Elijah Williams sought to implement required patience, persistence, and an unshakable belief that progress was possible, even in the face of resistance. Weeks turned into months, and while not everyone in the precinct embraced Elijah's vision, the undercurrent of distrust and hostility began to shift. Officers who had once been skeptical now approached their work with a renewed sense of purpose, inspired by the captain's unwavering commitment to integrity. The community, too, began to respond. It wasn't immediate, but small gestures, smiles, nods, even a tentative "thank you" from a local shopkeeper, were proof that trust, once shattered, could be rebuilt. Yet, even as progress was made, challenges loomed. Elijah knew that true change came not from individual victories, but from the collective effort to sustain them. The day began like any other, the early morning light casting long shadows across the precinct's gray walls. Elijah arrived before most of his officers, his routine a quiet testament to the discipline he expected from others. He moved through the precinct with calm purpose, acknowledging the few early risers with a nod or a brief word of encouragement. In his office, a stack of reports awaited him. Among them was a notice, Howell's formal appeal against his suspension. Elijah read it carefully, his expression unreadable. Howell had been quiet since his suspension, but Elijah knew better than to underestimate him. The appeal was combative, accusing Elijah of overreach and claiming the suspension was motivated by personal bias rather than professional misconduct. Elijah set the notice aside, his thoughts turning to the upcoming hearing. It would be his first major test of leadership since taking command of the precinct. If he failed to handle it with fairness and transparency, the progress they had made could unravel. The hearing took place in a neutral venue, a stark conference room filled with the hum of anticipation. Officers from the precinct attended as witnesses, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Howell entered the room with his trademark swagger, his sharp suit and confident grin designed to project an air of invincibility. Behind him, a handful of officers sat in quiet solidarity, their loyalty to Howell unshaken. Elijah arrived moments later, his demeanor calm and composed. He carried a single folder, its contents meticulously prepared. He met Howell's gaze briefly before taking his seat at the front of the room. The proceedings began with a review of the charges against Howell: insubordination, reckless endangerment, and violation of departmental protocol. Howell's defense hinged on the argument that his actions had been misinterpreted, that he had acted in the interest of public safety and had been unfairly targeted by a captain looking to assert his authority. Elijah listened without interruption, his face betraying nothing. When it was his turn to speak, he stood, his presence commanding the room. "This isn't about asserting authority," Elijah began, his voice steady. "It's about accountability. It's about holding ourselves to the standards we claim to represent. Sergeant Howell's actions on the night in question were not only reckless but dangerous. They endangered the suspect, the officers involved, and the integrity of this department." He paused, letting his words settle. "But this isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of behavior, a pattern that undermines trust, not just within this precinct, but with the community we serve." Elijah presented his evidence methodically, each point supported by testimony and documentation. He didn't raise his voice, didn't rely on theatrics. Instead, he spoke with the quiet conviction of someone who believed in the power of truth. When the hearing concluded, the panel deliberated for what felt like hours. Howell sat with his arms crossed, his smirk fading as the weight of the evidence became impossible to dismiss. When the verdict was announced, an upholding of the suspension with additional disciplinary action, Howell's composure cracked. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low and menacing. Elijah met his gaze, unflinching. "No, Howell," he said, "it is." The aftermath of the hearing marked a turning point for the precinct. With Howell's influence diminished, the remaining officers who had aligned themselves with him faced a choice: adapt to the new standards or face the same consequences. Most chose to adapt, though not without resistance. Warren, once caught in Howell's shadow, began to emerge as a capable and conscientious officer. He sought out Elijah's guidance, asking questions, seeking feedback, and volunteering for assignments that required leadership. His transformation was gradual but genuine, a testament to his willingness to change. The community's response was equally telling. Reports of police misconduct decreased, and more residents attended town hall meetings organized by the precinct. Elijah made it a priority to be present at these meetings, listening to concerns, answering questions, and acknowledging the work that still needed to be done. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah found himself walking through Elton District. The streets, though still worn and scarred, seemed lighter somehow. The laughter of children echoed from a nearby playground, and the glow of streetlights illuminated faces that no longer turned away in fear or suspicion. He stopped at the convenience store where his journey in the district had begun. The clerk greeted him warmly, offering a brief update on the neighborhood. It was a small moment, but one that carried a profound sense of accomplishment. As Elijah continued his walk, he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the challenges he had faced, the resistance he had overcome, and the victories, both small and significant, that had marked his tenure as captain. But most of all, he thought of the people who had made it possible. The officers who had chosen to do better, the community members who had dared to hope, and the countless others who believed in the power of change. Back at the precinct, Elijah sat in his office, the city's lights twinkling in the distance. His desk was cluttered with reports, but for once he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He traced the faint scar on his hand, a reminder of the encounter that had set everything in motion. The knock on his door was soft but insistent. "Come in," he called. Warren entered, a hesitant smile on his face. "Captain, I just wanted to say thank you for believing in me, for believing in all of us." Elijah nodded, his smile faint but genuine. "You've earned it, Warren, and this precinct, this city, is better for it." As Warren left, Elijah leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the precinct's logo on the wall. The battles would continue, the challenges would persist, but for the first time he felt the tide had turned. Change was no longer just a possibility, it was a reality. And for Elijah Williams, that was enough. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. Share the video with your friends to discuss important topics together. And be sure to check out the channel for more interesting stories. See you in the next videos.